Do generations accurately remember and understand the context of their generation's history? Good afternoon. My name is Aaron Brown, chair of the Institute for Generational Dynamics. This is Gen Z Deep Dive, Season 2, Episode 16. And we are broadcasting live from our studio here in Colorado Springs, Colorado. So, Miriam Noor of The Daily, or at least wrote an article for The Daily, asked the question, is COVID-19 our generation's defining moment? Tagline, social change will be Gen Z's lasting impact. And so I want to just kind of break down their article, and my goal is not to be condescending or persnickety. I think that there are just generational attributes that have to be discussed for generations to really understand themselves. And I think the first element is that generations are often broke into two halves. So you have a first half called a first wave, and then you've got a second half called a second wave. Those who are born at the beginning of that generational demarcation are called cuspers, as well as those who are born at the end of that generational demarcation. So cuspers would be millennials and Gen Z, millennials being born 92, 93, 94. That's kind of the end. And then you've got Gen Z 95, 96, 97. And they kind of make cuspers. So they kind of have similar experiences, sets them a little bit apart from the descriptors of the whole generation, especially the first wave or the second wave. So just want to analyze some of what Miriam has to write. And I want to begin with her last few statements. She says, "We are not the generation of the coronavirus. We are the generation that traded helmets and bikes for headphones and iPods. We are the generation that marched for our lives. We are Sandy Hook and Stoneman Douglas. We are DACA and Dreamers. We are love who you love." And I think the reality is that Miriam is idealistic in what she has written. She thinks that the cultural shapers of her generation, that she had something to do with it. No, she was deeply influenced by the shapers, but in actuality, Gen Z has very little to do with anything that has happened during this period, as it is with most people in their first 20 years of life. So, for instance, when she says, "We are love who you love," there's elements of that are true, but the reality is when we talk about gay rights in America, much of that was fought in the 80s and 90s. I often mention, I believe it was Matthew Shepard who was murdered in Wyoming for being gay. Miriam and the Gen Z generation had nothing to do with those civil rights initiatives that moved those things forward. She was a child, so she had nothing to do with making that happen. So there's a little bit of a misremembering or a romanticism with her generation's connection to these things. So yes, Miriam's generation may show some of the larger trends of sexual identity, things like that, or higher population, but they're not necessarily the wave of social change for those things. There's other people who fought for those things to be different in our society. So as we kind of break down Miriam's article, she begins Gen Z from 1995 to 2010. I just think she's wrong. I think it's 2012 or 2013, given that Gen Z is the youngest is age 7 this year. But we're arguing over little things. Let's see. So she says, Gen Z is currently in our formative years of late adolescence and or early adulthood. Yes, that's very accurate. And She makes the statement, currently in our formative years of late adolescence or early adulthood, we are facing our generation's greatest challenge, the COVID-19 pandemic. If you are in the workforce, yes, this is especially true. Yes, in the home, as a teenager, Gen Z teenager, Gen Z, uh, ages 7 to 12, yes, this is true, but not in the way that Miriam would think that it is. So, for instance, she writes, the sentiment is analogous to 9/11's effect on millennials and presumably what World War One was for the historical lost generation. Um, and I think she's taking a little bit too much credit for what is called age location. And so, in age location, the question is, where are you located in history? Well, if you are a child, teenager, adolescent, young adult, during this time, you don't get to shape much of history. You're actually affected by it. So she even tries to make the claim that Gen Z is affected by 9/11, but all of the research and even just qualitative observations show that Gen Z is not greatly affected by 9/11 because majority of them were like 5 or 6 and not even born when 9/11 happened. So it's kind of like when you go to the party, but you got there late and you missed the guy who jumped off the second story into the swimming pool, and everybody's telling you how cool it was and how it just changed the dynamic of the party. You missed it. You simply missed it. You just weren't aware that it happened. You weren't even there at the party. And so this is kind of the same analogous example where I think Miriam is missing it a little bit. My generation, millennials, we are deeply impacted by 9/11. It caused many of us to sign up and go to war to fight the war on terrorism. What is Miriam signing up for? What will her generation sign up for to stop COVID or something like that? Um, so she goes on to say, and this is not to mention everything else that has happened between then and now that has had a lasting and profound impact on Gen Z. So she talks about October 2001, the advent of the iPod. Yes, that's very much a shaper. She's absolutely right. These technological changes would shift how young people interact with technology and the innovation of technology that would come out. So smartphones, if you've been around the Institute for a while, you know that smartphones have shaped mental health in America. It does affect all of us, but Gen Z especially, because they grew up with they became teenagers when social media really began to take off, and it has affected their brains very much for the negative, created higher levels of anxiety within them. Let's see. Let's see. So she says, on a more serious note, there has also been a definitive increase in gun violence during the lifetime of members of Gen Z. Yes, that's very true. Obviously, as a millennial in high school in the late 90s, I experienced Columbine, seeing that on the news, deeply affecting us, but that seemed like something far away. I grew up in Oklahoma. That happened here in my now home, Colorado. And so, yes, Gen Z has grown up with the issue of gun violence and school shootings at the forefront of their mind, increasing their levels of concern and anxiety. Let's see. She writes, March 2020 was the first March where there has not been a school shooting in the United States since the year 2002. So, yes, very much a shaper. She talks about the election of Barack Obama, first African American president here in the United States. That is a shaper. Again, Gen Z had nothing to do with that. They were nowhere near voting age at that time. Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage in 2015. Yes, that's a shaper. So if you talk to a Gen Z person today, uh, marriage is marriage. Like there's an ubiquity to it. There's a normalcy. Whereas those who are millennials and older, some of us were surprised, some of us were celebratory, some of us had a range of emotions when the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage. But with that said, again, that's a shaper, not a. It's not something that Gen Z was actively engaged in. Let's see, on November 8th, 2016, Donald Trump was elected as the 45th president of the United States. Um, Experts have speculated that if Trump had acted more competently and quickly in this COVID-19 response to the situation in this country would not be as dire as it is right now. So we see that Miriam is on the more progressive side of the spectrum and has forgotten that many news outlets like the Washington Post, New York Times, Vox, even CNN, they reported that this COVID-19 thing was not going to be an issue. Fauci got on, Fauci is quoted as saying, no, this is not an issue. Everything will be fine. So you can argue that with me offline. That's not where I need to hang out. But again, Miriam is at least shaped by not really following the news as closely as she should. So we'll end it as we began it. She says, we are not the generation of the coronavirus. We are the generation that traded helmets and bikes for headphones and iPods. We are the generation that marched for our lives. We are Sandy Hook and Stoneman Douglas. We are DACA and Dreamers. We are Love Who You Love. And the reality is that Miriam is a lot like a famous Thomas Jefferson quote, in that Thomas Jefferson said, never be too proud of your ancestors and where you came from, because you didn't have too much to do with it. And so the reality is, if you know generation theory, and I'll just lay it out real quickly, if you know generation theory, then you know that this is actually what happens every time there is a Gen Z generation. The lost generation, who came of age in the 1950s, late 40s, 1950s, they were a Gen Z generation. And the reality is that it is a generation shaped by forces when they're coming of age and early adult, but spend most of their lives feeling disenchanted, like they never really had anything to add to. And so a lot of times I hear people say Gen Z is the most social justice minded activist generation. The reality is that's just not true. Millennials will always trump Gen Z. The children of millennials that are coming up, right now they've got the name Alpha. I think it's very premature to give them names. So that's why the Institute's probably going to name them ourselves. But Alpha will outdo Gen Z when it comes to activism, because that's the way the cycles of history work. And so I think Miriam has a really good article here. I think she does a great overview. I think that the tone needs to be a little different, in the sense of taking too much ownership for the events that have happened, and maybe having a little bit more realization that she is shaped by these things, not responsible for these things. So thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Aaron Brown, chair of the Institute for Generational Dynamics. You can reach out to me at my Twitter and Insta handles. That is at IGD_Aaron Brown. And you can always email me at aaron@draaronbrown.com.